all of a sudden we just hear this like almost like a wave of sound coming from behind us. And so we just instinctively like duck down. And pretty soon we are surrounded by hundreds and thousands of caribou. And they just kept coming and kept coming and kept coming. And they were so close at one point, Pat just sat down quickly and had his legs outstretched in front of him. And a big bull actually like stepped over his legs.
Well, hey everyone. Welcome to episode 373 of F-Stop, Collaborate, and Listen with your host, Matt Payne. This week on the podcast, I was joined by author and biologist Caroline Van Hemert. Caroline is best known for her amazing biologist coming-of-age book, The Sun is a Compass, and she's currently living on a sailboat with her 2 kids and husband. What an amazing life. Caroline was recommended all the way back on episode 229 by Claude Fiddler, so it was great to finally get to connect with her. Today, Caroline and I discuss different strategies for combining written narrative with still imagery and video, and various psychological and logistical challenges that we've both faced relating to book writing and creativity. Before we get going, I want to see if anyone can offer up some help. I know that not everyone has the means of supporting the podcast on Patreon. However, perhaps you have a skill set that you could help the show out with. Maybe you love social media and want to help push the needle on helping to grow the show. Whatever you think you might be able to help with, please reach out. And of course, if you like the show, one of the best ways that you can help out is by simply leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, or if you're watching on YouTube, subscribe. It's one of the best signals that can help a podcast get recommended to other people, which helps a lot. Thanks in advance for the amazing community of like-minded photographers who are helping to keep this show alive. You're all amazing. All right, let's get to this week's episode with Caroline Van Hemert. All right, Caroline Van Hemert, it's great to have you on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm excited to be here and have a chat.
Yeah, absolutely. You came recommended a couple of times, and I apologize because I can't remember who recommended you, but it must have been somebody that I have a high opinion of, because I was like, yes, I'm going to check that person out. And I looked at what you're up to, and I was really impressed.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, it's fun to be here, and definitely lots of great folks on your show. So any of them I'd be happy to have a recommendation from.
Awesome. Well, for people who aren't familiar with you, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Yeah, my name's Caroline, as Matt already said, and I'm a wildlife biologist and an adventurer as much as I get the chance to be, and a writer and a photographer kind of at the same time. I've written a book called The Sun is a Compass, and kind of based on a long journey, human-powered journey, but hopefully based on a lot more. Birds are pretty central characters to my book. And there's some photographs in there. Some were taken by myself and some were taken by my husband, Patrick Farrell. We have 2 young kids who are 7 and 9, and currently living on a boat and exploring a different part to the Arctic. So I'm from Alaska, and that's where most of my work and life takes place, but we're on a 43-foot aluminum sailboat that's currently in Scotland, and plan is to head up to the Arctic, kind of on that side of the world. So I think that's more or less covers it for the moment.
All right. Well, man, we can take that in lots of different directions. I was going to save this to the very end, but let's hear about your book, The Sun is a Compass. What was that about?
Yeah, so it's actually been now about a decade ago, but Pat and I, before we had kids, we took a sort of expedition starting in Bellingham, Washington, and ended in Kotzebue, which is the northwestern part of Alaska up in the Arctic, on the shore of the Chukchi Sea. And we did it all human-powered by means of different forms of transportation. So started with rowboats that we actually built ourselves, then skis up and over the Coast Mountain Range, some pack rafts, canoes, lots of foot traffic walking up and over Brooks Range and along sort of the crest of it, and then ended in the Noatak River. So about 4,000 miles, which I don't think the specifics of that maybe matter as much as just the nature of the journey and all of the things that we got to see along the way, but covered a pretty big swath of Alaska's backcountry and a lot of Canada as well. And then, naturally, for me anyway, evolved into a bigger story. It's kind of a memoir about my role as a scientist and some of the relationships I have to the natural world and to birds, and sort of evolution of family and various things. So yeah, that's the book, I guess, in a short summary.
Yeah, that sounds fascinating. And we'll definitely talk a lot more about kind of combining books and photography and writing and stuff like that later on. First, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about this expedition you're doing in a sailboat. What that sounds like a fascinating adventure. Tell us what that's all about.
Yeah, so it came about in part, I guess sailing, I should say, came about in part after having kids. And so a lot of Pat and I's journeys and time spent in the wilderness have been in settings that are a little bit tricky when you start to involve small people, especially, as they evolve through their different stages and carryable or not carryable and those sorts of things. And so we first got a sailboat. I guess we had a sailboat many years ago. We lived on in Bellingham, Washington, and then we had not done any sailing for a number of years. And then I think it was 2018, we bought a sailboat down in Washington and brought it up the Inside Passage. And we had a not quite 2-year-old and a not quite 4-year-old on board. So that came with lots of fun adventures, and actually got to document that. That was the first sort of big media piece I had in the New York Times, which it was kind of curious how much feedback you get when you introduce your kids to these wild settings that to me didn't feel that wild. I thought, I'm writing this sweet little story about, my boys on a boat. And turns out there's a lot of parents who think that taking kids on a boat is not maybe the best idea. But of course, it's that whole sense of, risk perception, and everybody's is a little bit different. And arguably driving down a freeway with 2 little kids is also a hazardous thing to do. But anyhow, that's sort of a side note. But that was how we got into sailing. And at least this time around, and started to really fall in love with that means of travel with a family. We've done some sailing around Southeast Alaska and able to access some ski terrain by way of the water, which is one of my favorite interfaces, that sort of marine mountain zone. And then I guess this trip has come about over many years of planning, and bought the boat, which the French are kind of known for building these Arctic or high latitude aluminum hulled sailboats. And so ended up buying the boat in France during the pandemic, sight unseen. You can talk to Pat about that a little bit more, but we have the boat now and have done a couple of shorter trips on it in Greece and some other places. And then this last fall brought it from the Eastern Mediterranean, so Greece near the Turkish border, and out the Mediterranean, up and around the Iberian Peninsula. Got to sort of bump noses with those rudder bashing orcas that probably some folks have heard about.
Oh, yeah.
And then up north across the Bay of Biscay, English Channel, and up to Scotland is kind of where the boat is now. And the plan is this spring we'll hopefully in a couple of weeks take off for Norway and other places up north, so Iceland and hopefully Greenland. You always, as a sailor, hate to lay out too many plans because life and weather sometimes have other ideas, but that's the general plan. And then come fall, we'll have to make a decision about whether we head south or lay the boat up or potentially head north.
Well, that sounds incredible. I mean, beyond the obvious in terms of, wow, what an amazing adventure and all the amazing things you're going to be able to see, what is the overall purpose of this particular trip?
Yeah, I think a big part of it maybe is this sort of reckoning with, so the north, I spend a lot of time in the north. That's really my home physically, but also like where my heart is and where my research is. And as a biologist, I think dealing with some of the changes that we're seeing associated with climate and, these really massive landscape and sort of population level changes, there's this weird reckoning that has to happen for me professionally. And then also personally, I have 2 young kids who are growing up in this world, and it still is an amazing and spectacular and in many ways very resilient place that, planet we live on. But there's all these things that trying to sort of make sense of that. So I would say that maybe in the back of my mind, and I can't speak to Pat's motivations as much. That's just something that I feel like, by being in it, somehow it's easier to try to wrap your head around it a little bit. And, we've done that in other capacities, but that I think is one of the things. And then there's just the pure love for adventure, so that I won't diminish the value of that. And I think our kids are at pretty flexible ages, so they're getting big enough that they can, be somewhat capable in terms of participating in things. They both like to ski. They're certainly not doing night watches, but they're more sure-footed and capable on the boat. And they're just game. They're really up for these kinds of adventures, and they're happy to be on board. And the schooling is still straightforward enough. So yeah, I think all of the pieces kind of aligned in our lives. I mean, I say that as though it's easy to just break away and go jump onto a boat. That's not been the case either. But yeah, that's the gist of why we're doing it now, maybe.
And is there like an end product or a book or a research that you're going to conduct? Like what? I mean, maybe the answer is no, but I'm curious if there's going to be something that you're working towards while you're on this adventure.
Yeah, I think, writing and book and sort of those product components are always, it's hard to know what the story is, I guess, until you've lived it, in my mind. I did get to write a piece about the orcas, which hasn't come out yet, but that will hopefully be an outside at some point. And I love it when I can sort of dive in with the research components and then the lived experience, and ideally capture imagery and observations and all of those different pieces at the same time. And so I'm hoping to get a few more articles kind of lined up, just so I have these things that I know I'm working on as I go. As far as a book, maybe, hopefully, but that's maybe a couple steps ahead of where I've really, specifically thought through.
Right on. Yeah, that makes sense. Well, maybe that's a good inflection point for us to talk a little bit more about books. I'm going to be the first to admit that this is a little bit of a selfish ask, because I'm in the midst of trying to wrap my head around my own personal book project that I've been mulling over since I completed the Colorado Trail last summer, and I came up with all these ideas while I was on the thru hike, and then I've bounced a bunch of ideas off of friends and things like that. So I'm really eager to pick your brain as a published author on some of these particular issues. Tell me about your thoughts on how to best capture outdoor experiences through both images and words. How can these two mediums complement each other?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, something I certainly think about, probably from a slightly different, I mean, I'm presuming some things about the book project that you're thinking of, and I'll be curious to ask you more specifics. But that for me, it was sort of narratively driven from the word side of things, just because that is more, I guess, where my experience, and I've been a super avid reader and writer all my life. And so that's kind of how I storytell. But I think sometimes images in combination with words just offer this perspective. Like I think about when I, stand in front of an audience and I'm speaking, if I don't have any images, it's the work is that much harder to really bring people into your world. And so sometimes just that, that single image can do so much to set people in the right place. At the same time, I think sometimes if you're trying to have words and images compete, there's always that danger that one or the other is sort of a disappointment to the consumer or the reader, for lack of a better word, because everybody's had that experience where they've read a book and it's like, oh gosh, I love this book more than anything, and then you see the movie, like, but that's not how I imagined them. Or even you just have the movie cover on the front of the book, and or an image from the movie, and it totally dispels whatever you thought you'd conjured up in your own mind. So I guess maybe this is a piece of advice that somebody gave me a long time ago, is that the images and the words ideally aren't trying to do the same thing. And that's what makes them complementary, is so then when you're capturing a story or painting a picture in somebody's mind of whatever scene, you want to illustrate, that the words are sort of doing that job and offering something different from or in addition to the image, or vice versa. Like if the image is primary, that the text isn't just narrating like what somebody can already see with their eyes. And those might seem like really obvious things, but I know when I was choosing photos to include for the book, I had a pretty limited number. So for those of you, probably most of you haven't seen The Sun as a Compass, it's, looks just like a traditional print book that is not a photography book. But in the center, they let me put in a select number of photographs, and I don't remember the total right now, but it's really hard to choose because there's so many things, and we had a lot of really fantastic images. But what are the things that are sort of filling in those gaps, or maybe going to stick with somebody in a way that not having that photo wouldn't do? But yeah, I'd be curious if you're are you imagining like a photo book that then has some text, or one that, there's some great examples, the Salmon Way and some of these other ones that do a lot with both words and images. I know Amy was on your show at one point. So yeah.
Yeah, it's it's funny because I have like several competing ideas floating around in my brain. Kind of the gist of what I hope to construct is a collection of essays that are kind of woven throughout my experience being a mountaineer and a backpacker in Colorado, combined with my photography that has been captured along the way in those journeys. And so I'm trying to piece together like what's the right amount of photos, what's the right amount of text, and then what you just said right there in terms of having the photos and the words not try to do the same thing, that was actually really helpful because I actually hadn't thought of it quite that way before, which, like you said, it seems fairly obvious, but it wasn't to me.
Yeah, and I think sometimes there's a point or a moment or a story where in our minds as the storytellers, we're like, oh, we've really got to communicate this because it's so central to whatever these larger things are. But just pulling out, and I'm sure as a photographer this well, that it's like those subtleties or those maybe hidden moments that people most respond and react to, as opposed to like the single beautiful landscape that is stunning but doesn't somehow capture us as much as something that's a little bit unique, or there's some aspect of that landscape that people wouldn't otherwise see. And so I think as much as those details can be brought out in both words and images, the more they resonate with people, maybe. I don't know. I'm always trying to figure that out. It's like the essential question of storytelling and connecting with an audience. But
Well, and you just hit my next thought on the head, because I'm thinking as you were talking about audience, right? Like if I focus more on the photography side of the adventure, then my target audience is probably other photographers. It's people who love nature photography. It's people who want to see those beautiful images. If I focus more on the tech side of things, then that audience shifts. And then I have to think about what audience am I connected with already? And it's not necessarily that shifted audience. So that's part of what worries me about how to best approach the project. But I just feel like the other thing too is just maybe don't think about that stuff and just work on it and then figure it out later.
yeah, I will say that was my strategy. I don't know if it's the best one, but I felt this sort of compulsion to tell a story, and I knew nothing about publishing. I knew nothing about how a book came to be in the world, and so that was a steep learning curve. But I think for me, there's different ways that you go about sort of pitching a nonfiction book, which I guess however you decide to compile images and words or whatever the structure ends up being, it would probably be considered nonfiction, whether it's more sort of memoir, personal essay, or not how to, but were you, when you said technical side, are you referring to potentially, I don't know, elements of the Colorado Trail or elements of mountaineering and almost guidebookish, or not so much?
No, I've actually already written a guidebook, so it's not that. It's more just weaving in that narrative of what those adventures were about and how they transformed me as a human, or how they laid the foundation for who I am as a person, and then like hopefully transferring over ways of thinking about life or the world to the audience through the photography and through essays.
Cool. Yeah, that sounds great. I mean, it sounds, so that I guess that would fit sort of loosely into the sort of memoir essay category. There isn't really a great, at least I haven't found one, a great, like booksellers don't know where to put books that are about the outdoors and, photography and memoir sort of all brought together. Although I think more and more, and science is really, science memoirs are becoming more of a thing. But I know that was a challenge, is that it sort of fits in all these different movable boxes and not into a singular one. But I think regardless of how it gets categorized, it sounds like it would be the kind of thing where you could pitch it before it's completed, as nonfiction is. Like memoir kind of falls into that blurry category. I think typically novels or fiction, the book has to be done before an editor will consider buying it. But then other projects, like nonfiction projects, they can be sold on proposal. And I won't get too much into technicalities unless you're specifically interested, but just this idea that how you go about it can be really different. And I think for me, there would have been, some benefit to trying to sort of pitch this book project before I knew exactly what it was. But for me, the writing is such an exploratory process. I don't really know what the story is that I want to tell until I've both experienced, but also written it, because there's that really active, reflective piece of it that I think is, for me, like the learning part as I'm writing. And so I don't think I would have pitched it correctly had I just been trying to say, hey, I'm going to write this book about this really long trip. Because that wasn't, that was a piece of it, but it wasn't the point. So yeah, I guess there's sort of the two, the two approaches. And, the nice thing, if you're writing toward an end, then you at least know that you're going to have an audience because somebody's agreed to do something with your book. But yeah, for me, that wasn't the right approach, I guess.
Yeah, and I'm kind of leaning towards self-publishing as well.
Mm-hmm.
I have some experience in self-publishing already, and even though I feel like your upfront costs are huge, you also have a lot more skin in the game to actually sell it. So, but then your reach and your audience is probably much smaller. So, there's definitely different ways of thinking about that too.
Well, and different skills are, you obviously bring some of the sort of marketing and outreach, and you obviously have people who already know to connect with you. And that's a really different thing. I had to be told by my publisher that if I didn't, I had to get a Facebook account. I had to join social media. And I'm actually not that much of a Luddite. I just get overwhelmed with the level of communication. I have a research job. I'm an author. I'm a parent. And then I, of course, just have like the usual communication. So I think I was just a little bit maxed out, and I had never really gotten into the business of marketing anything that I did as an adventurer or otherwise. And we were arguably doing things that potentially could have been sponsored, but that just wasn't really our style, I guess. And it wasn't something that I was just trying to get everything buttoned up so we could go. And the idea of like trying to pull one more logistical piece by asking somebody for, this or that, it just wasn't really part of how we got about things. So that part was really intimidating to me, the self-publishing. But yeah, I can think of at least a couple of folks up here who've been really successful with the self-publishing, and maybe a little bit more of a how-to as opposed to purely personal essay. But Luke Mell is one who comes to mind, the Pack-Crafting Handbook. And he ended up self-publishing, and then I think went through Mountaineers Press after that, but won Banff Mountain Book Award this last year, I believe, or maybe it was 2 years ago. And then Joe Stock is another one. He's a ski guide up here in Alaska, has kind of local legend, but he has also recently, he's self-published a couple of books, but he has a recent avalanche book out. And so those are interesting models of folks who are pretty good at that other side of things, which is like, I think as much as selling a book as it is just writing a good book or putting a good book together, is being able to reach the people who might want it and doing that marketing piece. So yeah, I think it gives you a lot of flexibility and, potentially control over how you want it to go.
Yeah, and I feel like if you go the publisher route, if I was smart, which I'm not saying I'm not smart, but it's not maybe something I want to pursue, is I feel like the book is just laying a foundation, if it's successful, to like be a lead magnet or to like get you in front of speaking opportunities, or like the book just creates this like persona for you that you can then market and sell in other ways, which I'm not that interested in doing. So it's like, I don't know, there's so many pros and cons to different approaches to it. At the end of the day, I feel like it just needs to get done.
Yeah.
That's the hard part.
Yeah, exactly. It has to get done. And the question I sometimes get asked is like, oh, you took this 4,000-mile human powered journey and then you wrote a book. Like, which do you think was harder? I'm like, oh, there's no question. Book. Far, far harder. Like, I don't know what to think about that one. But yeah, I think, and it sort of depends too, if you're looking for more of that like literary audience, which I think some of the bigger publishers have inroads to that, but then they maybe don't know the outdoor market quite as well. So I think as far as like speaking opportunities or finding those right audiences for other outlets, honestly, the connections that you make through these other means, I think is probably a bit better lead in than just a straight up like publisher's not going to necessarily find that for you. Even, I was published by Little Brown, and they're, reputable, pretty solid all around good publisher, and I had a really positive experience. But as far as like finding the right places to piece the right places to piece sorry to place articles or finding speaking engagements, those really came about through other mechanisms, just because I knew that world a little bit better. I would say one thing that I maybe would do that I didn't do with the first book, and I'm trying to wrap my head around a little bit more now as I'm working on other projects, is finding those short form outlets. So, and you probably already do that or already thinking in those terms, but I think if you can place pieces with magazines, and that can be like a really nice calling card or whatever you want to call it, that would sort of allow you, if you did want to consider publishing a more mainstream route, or even if you didn't, then it's just a really good way to get the word out there. I had a piece come out I think it was right around spring or right around Easter of the pandemic in 2020. And it was about a full year after my book had been published. And New York Times, I was just kind of right time and place, and maybe captured what people were looking for at that moment. And I got an opportunity with the travel section to do a big, like, full spread on the trip. And it was specifically about Caribou and this experience I had had, and how it linked to the feeling of kind of the opposite of being out and free, and all these things that were happening, when we were all in our homes and feeling pretty constrained. But I would say, like, that was actually the one thing I saw really bumped up interest in the book. And it was just, the right time and place. But I think if you can get those things going as you're sort of building momentum for a bigger project, I know in my limited experience, that does seem to make a big difference. And it also kind of gives you these little, points of some immediate return, whereas a book project can just feel so endless, and you're kind of in your own little head, in your own little world, and wondering if anybody's ever even going to see this thing that you're, staying up till 2 a.m. and trying to sort out. So I think those shorter pieces are really nice in that sense, that it is kind of gives a little bit more immediate feedback along the way.
It's good to think about how you can find synergy with other projects that give you revenue, if that's something you're interested in. I mean, most people have to put food on the table. So, but I think, from a photography perspective, I feel like there's a lot of parallels too, whether that be like a competition win or getting your work into a gallery. You can then try to branch out in other ways to capitalize on different wins or different ways in which you've found yourself published or whatever, to then kind of build your career in photography, whether that be, like you said, writing for magazines or being guests on other podcasts or just becoming a content expert or whatever. So I think there's a lot of parallels between the book writing world and the photography world.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I was thinking about too, as you're talking, is just those overlaps. So any opportunities to do artist residencies, I've had a chance to do a few of those, and just the amount of energy and that sense of community and other sort of creatives who get that, crazy obsession that we sometimes have when we're digging into a project. And so most of the ones I've done have been a mix of writing and visual arts. And that's been so cool to see people's process, even though it might be in a medium that's completely unfamiliar to me. But to see how, these projects come into being. And I would say any residency opportunities are always so fantastic, kind of across the board, and whether it's visual or literary arts.
Yeah, that's perfect. Well, let's talk a little bit more about photography. So
Great. Yeah.
In my mind, so much of photography is about storytelling, especially in landscape and nature photography. How does being an observant naturalist improve your storytelling capabilities?
Yeah, I think without being a naturalist, I would have no stories to tell because so much of what I write about and what I take pictures of and what inspires me is the natural world and critters doing their very sort of ordinary critter things, but they really aren't ordinary when it comes down to stepping back and thinking about it. So I think those moments of observation for me are really like a window into these other stories, and sometimes they ultimately are a story about ourselves or about these sort of human tales, but a lot of times it's just the story of how animals make a living, or how these incredible natural occurrences happen, and things that we don't always have the chance to think about really intellectually, it's kind of like, oh, we know that, chickadees disappear every night and somehow we see them again the next day. But like, how does that actually happen? Because it's really quite phenomenal that this little 10-gram bird can survive in -20-degree weather and then come out the next morning and be flitting around. And so, yeah, just I think some of those little moments where you take an extra second or minute or day to sit and observe, for me, it creates opportunities to take photographs that you otherwise wouldn't be able to, but also just to think more deeply about some of these so-called ordinary acts in the natural world.
Yeah, and from a practical perspective, I think there's a lot of utility in terms of finding ways to improve your photography or to improve your ability to capitalize on different moments that you might not even know were coming. I have a good example of this. I recently was very fortunate to have a partner workshop instructor with me in Yellowstone. And my partner, her name is Kathy Lichtendahl, and she's a certified naturalist. And we had walkie-talkies because we had two different cars, and we were talking to each other as we're driving our clients around the park. And I'm just a really curious person, so I would just constantly ask questions over the walkie-talkie, and she just knew everything. Like I would ask her, why are the beavers so important for the restoration of the park, and how are the presence of wolves impacting beaver restoration, and like what's that chain? And she just knew all the answers and could explain it. And then it enabled me to start looking for those stories in the landscape in terms of like, oh, there's a beaver. I'm watching this beaver carry some willow branches, and now I understand why that's important and what that's doing for the ecosystem, and how that translates downstream and all those things. So it was a really powerful experience for me to like see the possibilities of what being a naturalist can offer you in terms of improving your photography.
Yeah, that's a cool story. And then you're probably poised to be looking for those things. I mean, I don't know if anyone's lucky enough to capture, a wolf, wolf eating a beaver, but you wouldn't necessarily know to like be looking, near a beaver lodge for wolves if you, I'm kind of making up some parts of the story here, but yeah, I think that that knowledge does allow you then to set yourself up for capturing those really unique scenes.
Well, we actually did get a chance to photograph a pack of wolves hunting a bison,
Oh,
which
cool.
was one of the most incredible nature photography moments I've ever experienced. And it was fascinating because I posted a video about it and received immense backlash from I just
Oh,
did not anticipate at all, because
yeah.
there's a lot of people out there that have negative strong feelings towards wolves, and
Yeah.
I guess I didn't realize that.
Oh, people were upset about just the fact of
Just
wolves being alive doing their thing. Yeah, that's true. It makes me think of American Wolf. I don't know if you've read that book, but since you were there kind of taking pictures and watched this, I think there's an amazing detailing of how these wolves have evolved to take down an animal that, most wolves would never even consider because it's so dangerous to hunt something that could so easily kill many of them. But
yeah, it was
um,
honestly, it was fascinating to watch the whole thing unfold, but then
yeah,
also just getting to see firsthand how the reintroduction of the wolf has improved the entire ecology of the park. I think that story is, I think we know the story, but I feel like there's so much of the public that just have not heard the story or can grasp what that story means. It's been really interesting, and I would try to have conversations with people about that particular story, about how an apex predator like reestablishes the health of the ecosystem and all of that. And people are just like, they're just killing all the elk, and because all they care about is that the elk are there for them to hunt, right?
yeah. Well, and I feel like the media narratives, like the mainstream media narratives, do predators get a really bad rap, and some of that is just sort of supporting the existing stereotypes or feelings, but I don't know. It's been interesting because I've now gotten to write about two sort of human wildlife interactions. One was a human bear conflict in Southeast Alaska, which also included a person getting mauled. But trying to pull up that story of the bears themselves, and this individual held like absolutely no ill will toward bears. It was really just an accidental encounter, but there are a lot of situations where the human bear encounters are so predictable because humans, we're sloppy. We don't do the small things we need to secure food and other, there's just like some basic things. But I think whenever you have the chance to tell, and it's not to diminish the potential hazards to humans, of course. I mean, like none of us are saying, yes, go send your small children out to get eaten by these, predators. Like that's not at all the point. But the point is that, when we have the privilege to, I guess, live in these wild places or to explore them or to just be there, we have a responsibility too. And some of that is like understanding. And this other piece on orcas was really interesting because these orcas have, arguably been behaving in ways that don't make them very popular. It's this critically endangered subpopulation of orcas, but they're running into sailboats, and they've now hit almost 600 boats and sunk a number of them. And it's a scary thing, like as a sailor with kids on, your family on board. It's like, how do you sort of negotiate that risk management, but then also just appreciate like what incredible, fantastic creatures these are. And yeah, that we are never going to know. We're never going to be able to get inside the heads of orcas to know exactly what their motivations are. Yeah, probably play, probably something to do with curiosity, but nonetheless, just to be able to like pull out those stories, like you're saying, and hopefully not everybody's going to agree with how we tell it. But I think that building awareness in lots of different ways that people can't always hear it the first time, but maybe they do the 50th time, or maybe they do because you can tell the story or show an image that's just a little bit different. I don't know. I guess I see that as part of my mission is not to convince people of something or a particular agenda, but that there's always more to the story. And as much as we can bring that up and bring in that natural history piece.
Well, there's perspectives, right? And having gone through that experience of witnessing the event, having an understanding of the ecology, and then getting the huge amount of backlash I received, my immediate desire was to like dig in and want to tell the story from all perspectives, like, and try to bridge that somehow in terms of to get everyone on all sides to just see each other's perspectives, so that then they can maybe come to some agreements on how to best manage the situation, knowing that the wolves aren't going away, humans aren't going away. Like, how can we make this work so that everyone's at least somewhat happy, right?
Yeah, or at least talking to each other and not like vilifying. I mean, I think that's the
right
kind of the worst thing that you can do in whatever perspective is like you just vilify the other side, and then nobody gets anywhere, and we're just all reinforced in our own entrenched views on things. So hopefully art in all its various forms, I think that's part of why I read, why I, am drawn to photography, why I'm drawn to all these different mediums, is that it makes me think, and it makes me hopefully think a little bit differently than I did when I started, because it's the beauty of art.
Yeah, it was fascinating how many people that I've never heard of these people before. They just somehow saw my video and it just went kind of viral. And they were saying like how I deserve to die because I didn't help the bison, and like that, I mean, I just received all of this negative attention, and I was like,
Wow.
I just filmed something that was happening in nature. I don't like,
whoa. Yeah. No, it is interesting. And I think there's this anonymity that people perceive too when there's an online forum. Like increasingly, I feel like that gives people license to say and do things they would actually not if they were face to face. And that is also, there's all these great opportunities that come about because we have so much access. But I think sometimes those communication channels too, there's this, and same thing if you write a piece and you look at, I mean, that was advice I received like after I had all that feedback from, what a terrible parent I was and blah, blah, blah. But was a good friend of mine who's a writer. She's like, oh, you never read the comments. That's like rule number one, which I don't totally agree with, but I can appreciate why that would be a good policy, especially if you're writing about something that's even like vaguely inflammatory, which I didn't think it was. But, everything becomes somewhat inflammatory, I suppose, if people have a laptop and lots of time and opinions. Come up with something to say to you, but
it's unfortunate. So you did this massive adventure. You're doing another massive adventure, I think a big part of what's compelling about doing the types of adventures that you're doing is that you get to see a lot of wildlife, which obviously can be very challenging to capture with a camera. What are your approaches to improving your capabilities for capturing wildlife with your camera?
Yeah, I think, gosh, just being there is certainly a big part of it. Like you said, that I would probably be a really lousy photographer. And I mean, arguably, I'm not a highly trained photographer, but in terms of getting some of the images that I have, it's only been possible by that sort of duration of time and exposure out in these places where amazing things have a tendency to happen. I think I've also learned I love, uh, sort of high resolution, close up nature photography, but that's not, I don't have the equipment or sort of the time. And like with little kids too, they're bigger now. So I can say like, hey, hold still and be quiet. But that has not been the case. You try telling a 2-year-old that, and that's not going to happen. So being okay with sort of that mix of sometimes it's just a moment to observe, and maybe there won't be any capturing of images except in my mind. And that's, I think, where my writing comes in, is that, I can sort of hold that and have a mental image, for lack of a better term. I realize we're not talking about that. We're talking about photography, but I think being able sometimes to just let that go and not have that sense that, oh, if I've missed the image, then I've just missed the whole experience. Because especially with kids, that they're really good at being so present that, half the time they'll be like, put the camera away. Let's just be here. So yeah, I think I try to find that balance, but then there's other situations where you don't have to have, necessarily like the best zoom lens or the best, equipment to just be able to capture the feeling. I mean, light, I think, is a huge one, is just looking for those moments where the light hits in such a way that, maybe a small subject really becomes illuminated. Or, yeah, I guess things that probably people already are well aware of, but I think that's what my eye is trained for, is not so much like, oh, is this the most beautiful, or is this, the coolest wildlife, but just like, is the light right so that I can capture it? I've begun to realize that there's just a lot of situations where the image isn't going to probably work for me with the setting that I have. Also, on a moving boat, you can imagine there's a lot of times where you have that. I mean, you're in all sorts of moving things. You climb, you do all these things that obviously put you in a situation where sometimes you have to choose between, is it the image, or are you just kind of dealing with your scene at that moment? But I think those are some of the main things. And just that sense of being observant, like being willing to wait and be still and be in one place for a little while. And I think on that first big trip that I talked about in The Sun as a Compass, some of these in-between places that we otherwise wouldn't have visited, by trying to connect the landscape, that sometimes those are the real surprises. And that's obviously on a big scale over the course of like days and weeks. But sometimes that's even the case on a really small scale, is that, taking the gaze away from the big, beautiful panorama and just like looking down at your feet, or I don't know. And I appreciate my kids in that sense, that they sometimes direct my gaze to a much more like local field, I guess. And that can be a way to see things that otherwise I wouldn't have.
I wanted to dig deeper into something you just said about just being present. I know I've talked to a lot of photographers who are like, I use a camera because I can't write and I can't paint and I can't draw, but I can use a camera. And I like to think of myself as being pretty good with a camera, but I can tell you, the more time I spend in nature, the more time I've realized there have been so many moments that I've experienced and witnessed that the camera, even in the right hands, still cannot adequately communicate what you experienced. And so I feel like that's where the writing sometimes can help bridge that gap. And so I'm curious for you, how do you kind of, like, let's say you take a picture of a wildlife scene and you know that it's not fully encapsulating what you experienced. What are the ways that you kind of bridge that gap with your writing?
Yeah, well, I guess specific experience or examples are always more helpful than like the really broad. So I'll just use one that I guess is an easy one for me to sort of visualize and to talk about. But when we were doing this large trip, and again, this is a number of years ago, but it still sticks with me. Like if I had to just say what was one moment in the outdoors that you will never forget and will like have forever changed you. we were paddling down the Noatak River. This was toward the end of our trip, and we saw what looked like a branch floating across the river. Turned out it was a caribou. It was antlers we saw. And then there was another one and another one. And it was the fall migration of the Western Arctic caribou herd. And so we pulled the boat over. We were rowing or paddling a canoe, pulled the canoe over, just kind of stop and watch. And it's like, oh, here comes some more animals and some more animals. We watched them. We thought they were getting close to being done. And then all of a sudden we just hear this like almost like a wave of sound coming from behind us. And so we just instinctively like ducked down. And pretty soon we are surrounded by hundreds and thousands of caribou. And they just kept coming and kept coming and kept coming. And they were so close at one point, Pat just sat down quickly and had his legs outstretched in front of him. And a big bull actually like stepped over his legs. And there's one image I have, and this was not because it was like, wonderful photography. It just so happened that this little caribou calf comes and looks right at us, and it's, I don't know, a foot or two away. And so, it's a little bit blurry, but just that like proximity of being in the midst of these caribou. But I think if all I had was photographs, like I never would have been able to fully communicate sort of the power of that. And so it was watching the individual animals' movements and how they sort of lined up, they stacked up at this river, and then how they interacted with each other, and how the cow and the calf pairs, how they were always leading the charge. Like they were the first ones to go, and you'd see them hesitate and they're like, we can't hesitate anymore. And they just had to go. And the bulls would kind of hang back and then they would go. And so just all these different like nuances of the herd and how they move together some of the footage that I'm sure we've all seen of big caribou migrations are so powerful, like that you see these, sinuous waves of animals moving across the landscape. And like, there's no denying that the imagery is incredibly powerful, whether it's video or photos. But I think for me, it was those really nuanced interactions that a photograph, for, at least my photography, wouldn't have been able to capture in the same way. But then the complementary piece of like having that caribou calf, right up close in the frame, and then another image where you can just see these animals swimming the river like that. That's a nice, I think, addition to just what the language itself can do. So I guess, yeah, that's like those filling in the gaps, but more than that, pulling out the immediacy of whatever that experience is, that sometimes I feel like with words, maybe you can achieve things that photographs don't, or in turn, sometimes the photos achieve what you can't quite. That classic phrase, like, I don't have the words to describe, and sometimes we don't have the words to describe. And that's where other visual media, I guess, come in, especially photographs.
Yeah, it's interesting because you figure like having the caribou stare right at you and you have that picture, that tells a really powerful story, but it's incomplete, right? But then if you were to write about it without the picture, the story is a little incomplete too. And I feel like that's one of the reasons why I've been gravitating more towards video when I encounter wildlife, because I find that the photos do capture things that video can't as well. But for some reason, when it comes to wildlife and watching them interact with the landscape and watching them do their thing, I find video is it just takes you there, and in a way that stills and writing can't, but also stills and writing can do it in a way that video can't either. So it's interesting.
Yeah. Another thing that when you mention video, it makes me think of some recent experiences. Just on the boat, we've had so many pods of dolphins riding our bow, and sometimes for minutes, or in one case almost an hour. Just these incredible animals. But I've taken video, and some of them turn out cool, and you certainly can appreciate like how they swim. And there's things I see in the video that I didn't maybe notice right away just by watching them. They flash their belly, or you see a young one right up next to the mother, and like how they move together. And so that is super cool, but then it doesn't fully capture that sense of like putting your head, hanging over the bow of the boat and putting your head down there and like hearing them whistle and hearing them click. And just that sense of like what it feels like to be that close to this wild marine mammal that is just doing its thing, and again, sort of ordinary animals by some estimation. They're, common bottlenose dolphins, or, there's many hundreds of thousands of them, but that doesn't change that incredible experience of like being close to them in that way. And yeah, so I think that will be an interesting exercise, because I haven't actually really written about the dolphins yet. I've asked my kids to write for their little school assignment. I'm like, oh, tell me what, use lots of descriptive words. Tell me what it felt like to watch the dolphins off the bow. But I should do that exercise myself and see how that complements the images or the video that I have.
Yeah, it's interesting. As you were telling that story, what came to my mind is a really good still image for me almost becomes an invitation to learn about the story or to tell the story, which can go in lots of different directions for the viewer, like especially if there's no writing involved, which I think is also kind of the power of still imagery when it's just by itself, is that it leaves the viewer to kind of imagine what it would be like to witness that particular situation. So I think it's just interesting to think about like the power of combining or leaving them separate.
Yeah, right. And that the space between, I guess, that's like there's lots of spaces between, but that giving our minds a little bit of opportunity to fill in however it's relevant to the individual. And maybe we have a tendency now, there's just so much out there and there's so much input. Like we don't have to wonder as much, I guess, because you can just Google whatever you want to know about. It's like, okay, show me an image of this, that, and the other thing. But yeah, I think that sort of imagination and the wonder, the more we can create space for that. And sometimes that is by leaving things unanswered or incomplete, probably the better for all of our collective imaginations.
Right. And along the same token, if I were to produce a photography book that just had a bunch of photographs of Colorado in it, I'm not going to have the same impact.
Yeah, absolutely.
Without writing, I mean, so.
Yeah, right. And those individual stories. And I mean, that's what, the sort of universality, I guess, of the individual experience, and making those connections for readers or viewers is, one of to me, the best things about making art and taking photographs or writing stories is that you have that potential to connect.
I love that. Well, so I know that you are spending a lot of time focusing your attention on the Arctic. Tell us about your goals in spending time in the Arctic, and what is it about the Arctic that compels you?
Well, I haven't talked much about my research, which is a little bit outside the scope of this conversation because I sort of have to put on my research cap or take it off. And, I do that as a very separate endeavor. But of course, like we are not discrete, broken up people. So all those things feed into each other when I think about, my role and place and how I write or how I take photographs. But most of my work has been in the North, and I'm Alaskan by birth and have lived here pretty much all of my life. I've gone away to college and lived in different places at periods, but more or less Alaska has always been home. So I think the North is just part of who I am. And I'm really drawn to these landscapes and to the wildlife that live here. And that's kind of my scientific professional knowledge too, is of Northern landscapes and wildlife and birds. So birds is more or less my primary background. And I guess by way of an answer to that, we were originally going to take the boat, leave the Mediterranean, and then go the way everybody else goes in the fall, which is cross the Atlantic and go down to the Caribbean. I don't know, just for me, the thought of like missing winter and going south, going to the heat, like for me, the fall is the time that it starts to get cold and snowy, and I love to ski. And so I was like, I don't know, this just isn't, I'd look at pictures of people like drinking their cocktails on the deck in the Caribbean, and I know it looks lovely, but it's just not, it doesn't get me excited in the same way that I look at these snowy fjords in, Norway or landscapes in Greenland, and I'm like, oh, that's my place. Those are my people. So yeah, I think it's always just felt like home to me. And I'm obviously really intellectually interested and sometimes rather heartbroken because there's so much change going on, and, whatever people's political leanings, like you can't live here and not be aware of those changes. And, not every single one of them is devastating, but there are a lot of things that are pretty fundamentally different than when I started in this field of wildlife biology, and even, wildly different from 10 years ago. So I guess I have this sense that I want to share some of those stories, and I don't want to write another sort of just straight up climate change book. Like I think there's plenty out there for people who want the knowledge and the information. But for me, it's that sense of being able to connect with people kind of across, different backgrounds and inclinations, and just to be able to say like, hey, this is a story of a place and my experience there, and with the family, and some of the ways I guess I'm grappling with these changes, or appreciating just the magic of how resilient animals can be in certain settings too. I think there's the more hopeful side of things that I don't want to diminish, and I think there's a lot to be found in that. So I guess as far as like why spending time, to me it's kind of like, well, why wouldn't you go to these places? Because they're the coolest on the planet in my mind. But I know there's lots of other really amazing places too. But yeah, I've just always been drawn to the North, and I think there's a familiarity to it, but there's a real newness as well, because I've seen some parts of the Arctic, but I do not know this part of the world at all. And it was actually interesting as we headed north, we crossed Bay of Biscay in November, which for sailors out there, that's not highly advised. It's not the right season. I mean, we obviously chose our weather window carefully, but every other boat we saw was going south. Like that's just the way you go that time of year. But we got to close to Land's End, which is in southwestern England, kind of the tip of land that sticks out there. It's very notoriously stormy, whatever, but we got to a little fishing community near there. And I remember my younger son stepped off and he was like, oh yeah, I think this is my favorite place we've been. He'd been to all these like really fantastic, beautiful Mediterranean spots and done lots of climbing and all sorts of cool things along the way, and all swimming, and all that was really wonderful. But I think just that, that sense of what feels like home, and some fantastic stories from the people we met on the docks. And as we've gone further north, I think we've just had a chance to connect with other people who share those passions. And that's always a nice thing when you can kind of find, that overlap in what draws people to places.
You spoke a little bit about kind of the changes that are happening with the Arctic, but all along the same lines, some of the resiliency that you're noticing. And I was curious, to me, that almost sounds like there's a fierceness to the Arctic, kind of like what you had shared with me earlier. But there's also a fragility, and there's a lot of places like that around the world right now. How can photographers highlight those two kind of contradictory concepts of fierceness and resiliency, or fragility, in places like the Arctic through our photography?
Yeah, well, not everyone's going to agree with me, but I have this sense that we're all a little bit saturated with the doomsday news, and the images and I can't remember where I was reading, but that polar bears are no longer utilized by some of the biggest wildlife foundations because people are just over them. It's, and they've maybe been used to a fault where there's a lot of other elements, and not to say that polar bears aren't imperiled, and there aren't, all these very acute challenges with loss of sea ice, and their habitats they depend on. But I think in terms of like how we capture those, the goal for me would be to not just have people immediately want to close the book or flip the newspaper over, or whatever it is, because even for me, with somebody who cares deeply about these changes, and I study them and I write about them, I also don't just want to read another sad story about the end of the world. And I honestly can't, I cannot go down that track fully with young children. Like that just is not a possibility. And I think I've kind of heard this more and more from parents and other people who care about this world, whether it's through their children or through their own eyes, is like, we need something else to hold on to besides you're all screwed. That isn't really something that inspires any kind of emotion except just this sense of futility. And let's just, go back to bed then, because what's the point? And I that isn't the way the world is right now. There's so many challenges that we have, and there's so many things that we need to act on. But first we need to care and to love these places and these things, whether they're our homes or somebody else's, enough to want to make a difference. And for me, it's that like getting into the sort of love piece of it. And that's where I think so much change stems from, is like, we have to do it because we care. And how do you, I don't want to say like help people as though I'm going to find some solution or handhold, but just, it's like, let people have the joy of that encounter. And, whether it's I'm looking outside because I've got a bird feeder and there's chickadees there right now. Whether it's like getting to know that little local chickadee and its particular habitat or habits, and then kind of extending out from there some of the questions about, okay, what does this actually mean? How do we make this a sustainable, longer term way and place to live, as opposed to just like, everything's dying in front of us, and that is true sometimes, and it's hard to know what to do with it. But yeah, I would say like finding those moments of joy, long-winded way of saying finding that joy and that care, and then sort of working out from there.
Yeah, it's interesting because I follow a lot of climate scientists and climate reporters on Twitter and whatnot, and most of the time it's they're sharing like these doom and gloom, like the world is ending, and I'm usually like, yeah, that sucks. I hate that, and I want to do something about it. But at the same time, to your point, if you get saturated with that type of information, you almost just feel like, what's the point of doing anything about it? Like it feels so insurmountable to so many of us. So I think I like what you said about focusing on the things that are happening that are good, and be curious and try to find your way of telling the stories that are positive, so that you can then work in some of that messaging after the fact that might change people's behavior a little bit.
Yeah, I think so. And I think just, there's this sense of wanting to be moved and wanting to find wonder, or to honor that part of the human condition as well. I mean, we need to do better, and we need to make change. And I certainly would like never diminish, if talking to a scientific audience, like what's actually happening and, what these changes are. And I wouldn't to a public audience either, but it's just one of those things like, okay, how do you sort of storytell in a way that is individually relevant? Because at the end of the day, like we all care about our own lives and our own families and our own homes. And so how do you sort of help make it relevant so that we're inspired to do better, and not just inspired to turn off the program or close the book. And that's ultimately, I guess, the challenge for all of us who want to make this a different, have a different trajectory than what we're on right now.
Yeah. So you're a mom, you're a busy writer. You're probably, when you're on a sailboat, you have all kinds of chores and responsibilities to keep the thing from floating in, from going to the bottom of the ocean. What are your approaches to making art when life gets in the way?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a good challenge. Set some resolutions right now, right? Well, yeah, and then I guess the one thing is when I'm on the boat, I tend to leave my research job behind. Like right now, I'm also doing research in the next few days before I take off for the boat again. So yeah, that it often gets squeezed out, I guess, is the really honest answer, is that is one of the first things to go, because it doesn't always make the like urgent to-do list, whereas some of these other things, like there is no choice but to get them done. And whether that's, dealing with boat stuff or navigation or kids' needs or, whatever other like day job work. But I am trying to more and more, and I think I learned this skill when I had really young babies or children, where there just is no time in the day. Like you don't get to take a shower or, do those sort of niceties. So it's like, you don't have to have like the perfect setting. It doesn't need to be like, here's my cup of tea, here's my pastry. I got all my little things lined up just perfectly. It's like, you have 5 minutes, make something of it, and maybe that's just a mental make something of it. Think about something that, you're interested in working on or writing about, or photographing, or, any elements of it that, I guess, just trying to sort of take all that little bits of cumulative time. Sometimes it's on night watch for me that I may not be able to write, or I can't write without a certain amount of focus. Like I can't just kind of, be looking out for ships and typing a couple brilliant sentences. I'm sure that some people are better at multitasking than me, but what I can do is like listen to podcasts, or I can be observant in a way that is hopefully like contributing to this sense of not forgetting. I think for me also, like this isn't an act of making art, but of keeping it on the forefront of my brain, is just keeping any of those communication channels open with other creative folks, whether it's like a WhatsApp chat, or keeping up on podcasts, listening to things, talking to people, sending an email here or there, just something so that people who kind of get that process and the compulsion to create, that yeah, I guess I need that in my life. And sometimes on a sailboat with just my family, it can be pretty isolating in that regard. So I'm trying to do better on the sense of just kind of keeping those channels open so that I'm reminded again and again, like why this matters and why I should do it when there's lots of other things that take precedence. But yeah, and I've been trying to get up, do the real early morning thing. But again, sometimes there's like life tasks that get in the way, even at 5 a.m. It doesn't, they don't care about the clock. So yeah, just kind of fitting it in whenever. And then I mentioned, having some of these article pitches hopefully lined out in advance. I need to send my pitches off. That's a good reminder to do that. Make time for that. But yeah, if I can have a few of those deadlines, I work well if I know somebody's expecting something from me. So trying to kind of create those forced opportunities, I would say.
That works really well for me too. Like if you create that intent or that purpose, it tends to give you a little bit more direction, or it forces you to work on something. Like, I mean, you've written a book. I mean, I know as soon as you like commit to yourself, okay, I'm writing this book. Okay, well, that's a big ask, right? And so then you have to
Yeah.
break that down into like, okay, I'm going to write an essay a week or whatever, however it is, right? And then, but at least then you've given yourself some kind of target to work towards, which forces you to prioritize some amount of time towards making steps to accomplish it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So goal setting.
Yep. Goal setting and maybe making realistic goals too. Cause I think sometimes there's a tendency to, build it up so much that it's like, oh, well, there's no way I could even begin to reach this. So I'm not going to bother. But yeah, just
Right.
realizing that
I'm going to write a book in a week.
Yeah.
Oh,
Or
good
even
luck
a
with that.
year, even a year is a really ambitious goal. So yeah, just understanding that things take time and that, yeah, there's whether taking pictures or writing paragraphs, it's like you have to understand that even if you're not doing it at that moment, it doesn't like diminish the fact that you are a writer or a photographer or an artist, and trying to self-talk that part I think is important too, because there's always that self-doubt that comes in whenever you're creating, at least in my world.
Self-doubt for sure, but also like, at least for me, there's always this nagging voice that's like, you need to do more today. You need to get this done. You need to get that done. And I always have to remind myself, like, if that doesn't get done today, it's probably not the end of the world, right? Like you could do it tomorrow. So it's
Yeah,
like
right.
balancing, the amount of demands you have on your time with, giving yourself enough space for self-care.
Yeah. And like going out and experiencing these things that sort of inspire us to do this in the first place. Cause yeah,
Right.
without that, it's like, wow, yeah, I don't know. I could sit and write something, but that's not what gets me going in terms of creating. So,
Right. So earlier we were talking a little bit about like book audiences,
mm-hmm.
and I was curious relating to books, but also photography. What do you think most resonates with your viewers and readers, and how have you come to determine that?
Yeah, that's a big question. I think pulling in little elements of the personal always help. There's a sort of tendency, and I'm trained as a researcher, so there's that I had to work really hard to like de-sterilize what I was sharing with people when it came to storytelling, because those are two very different things, like a scientific audience versus, the audience that I'm writing or taking photographs for. And I think anything that can, one, like show somebody a little piece of the world that maybe they would otherwise not have a chance to experience. And, it could be crossing the Bay of Biscay in November. It might be, a dolphin splashing us as it's coming out of the water or something like that. But then people also just kind of want to know about some of the ordinary, like what does it look like to, and I'm not as good about remembering to share this stuff because it seems kind of ordinary, but it's like, what does it look like to, stay up all night on the cockpit of a boat? And, what does it look like for kids to do their schoolwork when the boat's like this and, heeled over? Or I don't know, just those sort of day-to-day life pieces that are maybe a little bit out of the norm of what most people are experiencing. And I think trying to remember it's those moments, those sort of personal moments that people are interested in. Like we all want to know when somebody introduces themselves, well, okay, yes, you have these accolades and you've done these things, but who are your people? Like who do you care about? Who cares about you? Like, yeah, what does your day look like? I mean, those are the details that I think we often neglect that we're all really curious about. We're all human. So,
Yeah, unfortunately for me, the number one question I get from people when I tell them about doing the Colorado Trail is like, how did you poop? So
oh yeah, yeah, right.
it's
Yeah, those
like,
simple details.
right, like, how did you handle that? It's like,
Yeah.
it's like, really? That's what you want to know?
I mean, it's like we all kind of have the same needs. And yeah, the more that people get that, yeah, same thing. Like, what do you do with dirty diapers? And we don't have, thankfully, my kids are 7 and 9. We don't have dirty diapers anymore. But yeah, just those those basic needs of like, how do you eat and
Right.
excrete waste and love and all those things that,
Like,
yeah.
where do you get water? Where do you get your food? Like all those kind of things that think people get really interested in, those things that maybe they've never even had to wrap their head around if they were to do something similar to what you've been doing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would say like the other side of that is that connecting with people, sometimes it is those shared experiences. So somebody has had, some little bit of sailing in their life, or at one point, I was the thing with the writing the book that was so cool is the stories that came out of the woodwork from other people who'd had these incredible adventures, or been to the same places for whatever reason, whether it was, recently or 50 years ago, or knew somebody in common. Had a couple of really incredible contacts come from this one college professor who I mentioned in the book, who is really influential, an ornithology professor. But I've since met some amazing, really accomplished and fantastic people who also knew him, and like just that one shared connection. So sometimes it's like the really unfamiliar that people are drawn to, but I think sometimes it's also like, oh, hey, I've been there, or I saw a show about this place, and so I'm naturally more drawn to it. So finding those points of overlap too, I think really brings people in.
Yeah, it's amazing too. I think people are so focused on how do I grow my business as a photographer? How do I, accomplish my goals in photography or maybe in book writing or whatever. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes I think the best advice is to do your thing, do it exceptionally, do really cool stuff, share your story with the world, and the people that attach to whatever that story is, that then is going to build this pathway for you that you can't even imagine. And that's definitely been my experience. I mean, 10 years ago, I would never have imagined that I'd be where I am today, but I was unknowingly laying the foundation for it by just going out and doing cool stuff. So I
Yeah,
think
I was gonna flip the question to you. Like, what do you find has worked best for you, and like what do people respond to? And I guess there's sort of like, what are the individual responses you get that are meaningful, but then also like, where do you just get the sheer numbers of audience members, right? Because that's at the end of the day part of what you need, I think, to make some of these things grow.
Well, gosh, I mean, a big part of it, I think, is self-awareness of kind of what makes you tick. Kind of know thyself, right? What are you interested in? What are you excited about? And focus your energy in being more and more curious about those things. And then sharing that enthusiasm authentically with the world. I think through that authenticity, people then gravitate more towards you. They want to learn more from you. They want to they just can relate to you more, right?
Yeah.
And then I think from there, it just becomes a matter of organically leveraging that authenticity in a way that is purposeful. But sometimes you don't always know what that purpose is ahead of time, I think that's the difficult piece.
Yeah. Right. Right. You don't know what the story is till it's made itself apparent.
Right. Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I gosh, way back in 2008, I was climbing the highest 100 mountains in Colorado, and I was doing this little blog I created where I would do these long, long, long trip reports with like 30, 40, 50, 60 photographs and like detailed descriptions of my whole hike and climb. And I did that for like a decade. And it led to me, like, this guy knew about it, and it led to him reaching out to me to do a guidebook with him. So, it's, you just never know.
Yeah, you never know, right? And I think, but yeah, you've got to sort of put it out there as the first thing, and sometimes that can be a hard step. Not, I mean, there's the vulnerability piece, but I guess it's also just like that you got to do that one extra thing, right? Of like joining Facebook. I don't tell people to do that.
Well, that's
It's not
funny.
even Facebook anymore, but just, I guess yeah, the first half of this last sailing trip, I posted nothing. I was so overwhelmed and so maxed out and I just nothing. And then okay, it's been 2 months. We're suddenly from Greece to the tip of Portugal. Somebody might, including my family, might want to know, how do we get here? How'd this work? But there's so much positive feedback, I think, and having those, you got to put it out there to expect that people are going to communicate back. So
Yeah, one of the things I did on the Colorado Trail, because I didn't have a lot of internet and stuff like that, and I couldn't process my photos, is I would just take 2 or 3 second videos every day. And then I would compile them all in an app called 1 Second Every Day. And then every 5 or 6 or 7 days, you would have a town stop. And I would compile those videos real quick. It's like a 30, 40 second video of what I've done the last 6 days. And I would just post it here's a bunch of videos that are compiled, shortened, that you can see what I've been up to. And that was kind of fun just to,
yeah, it's cool.
and they're not good videos. They're not it's not polished, but it just shows people what it was
Yeah. Where did you post them? Did you do it to your website or to Instagram?
Just on
or
Facebook.
Facebook. Okay. Yeah. 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 Right.
Yeah, I wasn't trying to get too crazy with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and some of those platforms, for all their shortcomings, it is just a way that you can share with people. And a lot of northern communities in Alaska, actually, Facebook is a primary communication channel. More and more now, there's Starlink, and people have more internet access. But prior to that, is they kind of some of these basic ones that you get online. And you're okay, Facebook. You know what's happening in the community if you're on Facebook. Or yeah, again, not to sort of promote any particular one, but I think lots of different ways of sharing hit different audiences, and that's probably important to keep in mind too.
Going back to the original question, though, about how you find your audience, connect with it, grow it, all those things. Way back in 2010, 2011, I was hiking a lot with a friend of mine. His name's Ethan Butte, and now he does a ton of podcasts for customer experience stuff, and he's super well known in that space now. But he was doing these blog posts once a month on his little tiny WordPress site back then. And he wrote this article and used me as an example of what something Gary Vaynerchuk writes about in a book called Crush It. And the whole idea was basically don't think about monetization, just figure out what something you're really passionate about, go do it, and then get excited about it, share it with the world, and some really cool stuff's going to come out of it, basically, is the gist of it. I'm sure there's much more to it, but yeah, that stuck with me, and I was yeah, I guess I'll just stick to it and see where it takes me.
Yeah, very cool. Yeah, well, the entrepreneur side, I still need a little work on that part of it, but I think it's all these things, you start to develop a platform or whatever you want to call it, and then you have a forum for sharing things, and if you sort of want to make art or write a book or something, it helps, I think, when you've already got a little bit of reach of people who have some interest in what you're up to, or shared connections. So
right. Yeah. Well, speaking of that connection, how do we know as creators when our work has truly inspired emotional connection with our audience?
Gosh, some of the emails I get are pretty fantastic. I think that tells me sometimes it's hard to keep up. It's all this stuff, you can only respond to so many emails in a week, and at some point you have to just not give as much attention to it as you would like. But I have gotten some of the most incredible, heartfelt, but more than that, just these stories from people of how the book connected for them or resonated for them. I got some amazing feedback from that New York Times article I mentioned with the Caribou, and I think it was just, you sort of hit people up. It's the right time and the right place, and at that moment in their lives. The Sun is a Compass is a little bit of almost like a biologist coming of age, and so I've gotten to connect with some really interesting and inspired, not super young necessarily, but younger audience. But then I also get these fantastic letters from people who are, 97, and something about that story, maybe they spent time in Alaska 65 years ago and they went for a week trip, and it stuck with them for the rest of their lives. So I think for me, that's what makes it seem like, oh, wow, this is actually reaching people and continues to reach people. And it isn't about how many books are sold or are you making, a fantastic living off of it. Because I think if it's just those metrics, for me, it would feel totally pointless. But it's just that those individual stories and the fact that it inspires me to reach out to authors who've really moved me or photographers who've really moved me, because it does matter and people hear it, whether you necessarily get an individual response or not. It's not always possible, but it matters, I think. And there's like the live audiences. I haven't done as much of that recently, sort of did a lot of events before COVID and then quite a bit of virtual stuff. But I think those live audience interactions can be really powerful too, when you get the chance to actually talk to people face to face and sort of feel the energy of the audience. I do really love that when it happens. How about for you? How do you know?
Yeah, no, as you were talking, I was thinking about this, and it's interesting because I think one of the most undervalued aspects of landscape photography is its power to relate people around a shared experience. So one of the things that happens to me every once in a while is I'll share a photograph from a mountain climb or from an area that's maybe pretty remote that not a ton of people have been to, but maybe it's like really amazing light that I captured and in an amazing setting, but not a lot of people are familiar with that spot. But the people who have been to that location and have spent the time getting there and understand what's all involved in that process, we have like this immediate connection through the image. And they reach out to me. They're like, oh my God, I did that backpacking trip 40 years ago with my grandpa. And they just get really excited around that emotional experience that they had. And the photograph is that conduit that kind of connects them to it. So I think there's definitely a power in photography to do that for an audience.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And just that little spark of, whatever sort of opens the door, like conduit's a great way to describe it, because it sort of leads you into this other place or memory or emotional experience, just like smelling something that is really distinctive can do. It's that ability, I guess, to just sort of trigger all these fantastic or maybe not so fantastic memories or experiences, right? Like it pushes somebody's button in a way that hopefully is positive or transformative in a good way. But
I love that. All right, so 2 more questions. First one is, you've talked a lot about your book, The Sun is a Compass. How do people get a copy of that?
Pretty much anywhere books are sold. So yeah, easy to find online. A lot of local bookstores carry it. I think particularly in the West, but yeah, a lot of hopefully local bookstores. So yeah, really anywhere books are sold, or on my website, there's a link. My website needs to be updated, by the way. This is a good prompt for me to, I think the last journey was like, I don't know, had not started yet with the boat. So I'm going to, for anyone who's interested, I'm going to start updating again.
I feel like
maybe starting tomorrow.
I feel like I've given you all these tasks. They're just asking.
Oh no, questions. They're on my list. Don't worry. I got my to-do list right here. They're there. It's just a good, like I said, you got to talk to other creatives because it'll elevate them to the top of the to-do list, above the taxes, above the, whatever packing list.
Nice. All right. And then last question, who do you recommend for the podcast? Who are some people that our audience should learn about?
Yeah, well, one person I mentioned previously, and he does a lot of amazing photography, and he's recently kind of started a business called Start and End at Home, I think it is, and friend done some adventures with him, but his name's Luke Mell, and he would be fun to talk to, and he's a data scientist by training, but brings sort of this interesting perspective to the outdoors, and he takes really fantastic photos. So I think he'd be a great one to talk to. Nathaniel Wilder is another Alaska-based photographer. He shoots for a bunch of different forums up here and nationally, but he travels all around the state and is, I don't know him as well personally, but we've certainly overlapped some, and I think his work is really cool. So it'd be fun to talk to as well.
Awesome. Well, Caroline, this has been a fantastic conversation. I feel like I learned a lot about you. I learned a lot about the creative process. And thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. It was super inspiring and fun to chat about some of these things and got my wheels turning. So I'll be thinking and hopefully creating, right? That's what we all create more.
Create
Some of
more.
it will be good. Yeah.
Love it. Well, thank you to Caroline for the great chat today on the show. While today's episode wasn't as heavily focused on photography, see what I did there? I hope you still found some value in our conversation and that it's prompted some thoughts in your mind. To help listeners digest each episode, I've created some questions for you to ponder and to respond to over on our Patreon page. Each week, when the episode comes out, I release a page on Patreon for that episode that contains thought-provoking questions, and I'd love to see your reactions and responses to those questions. Joining Patreon is completely free, so head on over to patreon.com/fstop and listen to engage. As an aside, these pages on Patreon are released early to our $10 per month supporters, sometimes as soon as 60 days before the public release, and it enables you to listen to the podcast early. That's just one of the many benefits you get for supporting the show on Patreon, other than feeling good about supporting something that you love, of course. Cheers. Okay, that's all for now. Thanks for stopping in, collaborating with us, and listening. See you next week.